Hello everybody, welcome to Nostalgia Goggles, the show where we talk about old video games and see if they're still worth playing today. I'm Chris, also known as Retro Gaming Nerd, and my format normally isn't like this, but it will be sometimes. Sometimes I, get up in front of camera, and sometimes I don't. It really depends on how much of a backlog I have, and recently I've had a lot, so I didn't really want to get in front of the camera today. I guess that's really the truth. But with that being said, let's talk about Pokken. So I think everybody, at least at one point in their life that's a Pokemon fan, asked what would happen if we had a Pokemon fighting game. Well, we have one officially. I know that there's a fan one that's in the making, but this is an official one that I didn't hear much about. It was released, and that's all I really know. I have no clue if people like it, I have no clue if people don't, but I did hear one time while I was watching a video, somebody said that they really wanted to get into Pokken, but it seemed to be a scary concept. Well, let's see if it's actually that scary of a concept. The story of Pokken is very simple. You are a trainer that wants to start getting into Pokemon tournaments, but during that Pokemon tournament, a Mewtwo with the Synergy Crystal sticking out of it thinks that you want to catch hands, and you do, so it is now your job, kind of, to stop him and win the tournaments, really. There's not really much of a story here, which is interesting because the people that made this game is Bandai Namco, and if you know anything about Tekken, that lore gets like ridiculously crazy, so you would think Pokken would kind of follow that same boat, but I guess maybe they might have thought that this was a one-off game or this is something, I don't know. Really, they didn't decide to make too deep of a story. It does go a little deeper than the way I put it, but in reality, I summarized it as best as I could, because that's really what it is. With that being said, though, none of that matters if the game doesn't play well, so let's talk about the gameplay. When it gets right down to it, the idea of a Pokemon fighting game definitely seems like a no-brainer, but this is not really a traditional fighting game when it gets right down to it on what Pokken is. Pokken decides to go for a unique style of fighting game where you are able to have projectiles alongside having close combat within the game. How this is done is that you have two kinds of modes. When you are far away, you are able to use projectiles, and I mean some close range combat, but that's not where it is normally. And then when you get close enough to them or you hit them enough, mainly if you hit them enough with projectiles, it'll eventually go into a close combat mode, which I believe is considered as the X and Y axis, I believe is how they call it. And with that being said, and how I'm talking about it, I feel like that alone would scare many people away from this game, because it isn't a traditional 3D style fighting game like Tekken, which is interesting because this was made by the people, or the company at least, that made Tekken, which isn't 100% fair to put them into that box, but it is still a crossover. With that being said, though, it's not as complicated as it sounds, and it is actually very fun, because I feel like the way that they put the battle mechanic within this game, or the combat mechanic I should say, feels like something that would make sense for Pokemon, since projectile moves are nothing new to Pokemon, and nor is close combat moves. Hell, there's even a move in the Pokemon franchise called close combat. And I think that this game does a really good job with what it does, and it's really fun. I love being able to knock your opponent in and out of these kind of things, which all in all, outside of that mechanic, the game's pretty much similar to most fighting games that have super moves and special moves. Once again, the super moves and special moves are used by pressing, I believe, the ZR buttons, or the bumper buttons, as I'm just gonna call them for both versions, the Wii U and the Switch. But it's really nice to have that, especially since they do a devastating attack, which is nice. It doesn't destroy your opponent, but it does give you an upper hand if you're going weaker, or it does allow you to secure a victory. I don't know how balanced this game truthfully is when it gets right down to the fighting style of it, because one, I don't hear people talking about it, so there's no videos that I've watched about the, balance of the game. It feels like there is balance, but it also feels like some characters might be better than others. I don't exactly know. All I know for sure is that the one thing that tripped me up is that it isn't a traditional fighting game, and I think that that's kind of what makes this one fun, because it turns something that could have been just a Street Fighter-like game into something that is very memorable, and something that I'd like to see Nintendo, or something that I'd love to see Pokemon Company come back to again. Because of the way that this game worked, I thought it was fun. When it gets right down to it, how this game works outside of the battle mechanic is it does the traditional things of where there is a story mode, there's a versus mode, and then there's an online mode. Now, one of the things that's very interesting about this is that you're not able to choose your partner Pokemon at any point. You have to go to your My Town to do that, and it does get a little bit frustrating. You would think that they would have fixed that from the Wii U to the Switch version, but I mean, it's there. Another thing that's really interesting about this game is that you can, and kind of do on accident by playing the story mode, upgrade your Pokemon through battle. I do not think, because I've had multiple times where it has not affected the story or the, you know, the tournaments that you are in, the battle does, the level of them doesn't affect it. You can still pull it off. It's a little rougher, but it's still a fighting game through and through, so it's nice to have these, and yes, it does feel better to have this leveled up Pokemon, but it doesn't, to me, feel impossible to challenge the other Pokemon. And last but not least, the last thing I want to talk about with this game's mechanic is that it does have a team mechanic where you are able to summon after a certain amount of charge, because the game automatically just charges them up. It allows you to have a partner Pokemon that will come onto the screen and they will do a attack or a heal, and it is nice. Some are better than others, and I just I don't know, I feel like it was a fun idea, but I think that they needed to do more devastating attacks or something a little better if they ever come back to this concept. I think the support Pokemon is something that really needs to be adjusted. So with all that being said, let's move on to the presentation. When it gets right down to the presentation, the first talking point that I have could easily be put into gameplay, because it is important to the gameplay, but I feel like it's more or less of presentation that matters more, and that is the roster of Pokken. I feel like they did a really good job with what they had, especially since this game could have been generic, but when I say good, I mean good, because it's not Pokemon you expect. I would have liked to see less bipedal Pokemon, because it's obvious to go with those ones, and I know that this sounds like a very weird complaint, because realistically this game could have just been all fighting type Pokemon, and that would have been fine too. I think when it gets right down to it, this game did a perfect middle ground of having non-traditional Pokemon that you would think in a fighting game, and not so much so that I don't think it's a problem. It's just something that I wanted to bring up in the presentation, and something that I wish there was more of. When it gets to the presentation itself, I think that this game is it's kind of rough, but I see what it's going for. I think that it tried to do the best that it could for being on the Wii U. I don't exactly know the specs of the Wii U, but the game definitely does look very fuzzy. Even on the Switch version, it looks pretty fuzzy, and I don't know why it looks that way, because it seems like they're really trying to be a little more detailed within the Pokemon, which, like I said, in concept, that works, because I like the detail that they put into the Pokemon. I like the detail they put in the world, but I just don't know if the Wii U could have handled it at the time. I don't exactly know why the Switch port was the same, and it wasn't as bad as the Wii U, and the game isn't bad either. It's just the game looks a little fuzzy. It looks like it's not rendering correctly all the time, is the best way to put it. And that's what kind of makes it hard, is that you could look at it and you know what I'm saying, and maybe you can't. Maybe it might be my TV, because the capture footage might be different, but even then I feel that there is something that just isn't altogether there visually. When it comes to the Pokemon though, it's great. I love what they did. They really tried to go for a more realistic style of Pokemon, while keeping it within the Pokemon's original designs, not taking a Detective Pikachu approach, but kind of becoming a more like, hey, we're gonna have feathers, you're gonna be able to see fur. That's kind of dangerous, because the game could have easily taken a Detective Pikachu approach, and it didn't, if that makes sense. But another thing about the presentation is that, I think I've said it before, and I'm gonna say it again, I can see what they're going for, and I think that that's why I appreciate it. The backgrounds are glorious, and I wish that I could have a better look at them. I absolutely love how they turned out. Like, I just love how the cities look. One of the levels that comes to mind is the mansion. I like how that looks. I like it all. I just wish it was a little bit more clear. And last but not least, I think when it gets right down to it, the music is great too. Not that I've heard it too much. It kind of is one of those ones of where I might have to turn up the background music. But from what I've heard through doing this video and obtaining music, I loved what I heard. I just wish that I would have heard more of it. And that might just be the cause of fighting games, because a lot goes on in fighting games. So much so that you can lose the music because there's so much to focus on. But I feel like all in all, when it gets right down to it, this game presents itself in a interesting place. The place of where I can see what they were going for, and I appreciate what they were going for, but the product itself doesn't 100% make it visually. Everything else, I think, works very well. With that being said, let's move on to accessibility. . 。 . 。 . 。 . . . 。 . . 。 . . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 . 。 .
「
So there was about 3 ways to play this game, and the 3 ways to play this was, one, I will believe was a promotional kiosk that allowed you to play the game in an arcade style, which came with a very specific type of controller, and I played it back in the day at YumaCon, back when it used to do the rounds at conventions and other stuff, and I have no clue where those went. I believe that those are promotional. That's what I found in my research looking for these, but I haven't found any of them on sale. That's one of those things that if I come back to this game, we'll eventually find, you know, maybe that, who knows. But to this point on, there's no way to buy that. With that being said, the other ways that this came out was for the Wii U and the Nintendo Switch, which the Wii U version will set you back about $15 to $20, and even then the 15's pushing it. I should more or less have said 10 to 20. Now, I feel like there's a little bit of a debating point on it as well, because there is a version that I cannot keep track of, which is the version with the Pokemon card, which is an amiibo, and I have no clue exactly which ones have it and which ones don't. And even then, it doesn't look like it alters the price. The card, by the way, is the Mewtwo. And then there is also the Pokken Tournament DX, which is for the Nintendo Switch, which realistically will set you back $30 to about $40. Realistically, you're looking more on $40, but if you look around, you can find it for less, which is inevitable. But at the end of the day, it's looking like you're going to pay $30 to $40 at most, mostly $30. And I feel like when it gets right down to it, yeah, that makes sense. This game is a newer game on a somewhat newer console, and I believe the price might only drop over time. Realistically, I think if I had to say a preference of one that you should definitely try out, you should definitely go with the Nintendo Switch version, because there is enough differences from that version. But there is a suffering point with that, because there is DLC for the Nintendo Switch version, and unfortunately, with the way that Nintendo has been, unless that they release this game one more time with the DLC included, I don't exactly know how to argue or say which version you should play, because unfortunately the future will come and the Nintendo Online Shop will end, and that's the only way you can get the DLC. So there's a point where it comes down to me saying, yes, the Switch version is better, but if I could plead, we should definitely get a complete version, which I think most fighting games should do over time. And I feel like that's not the biggest issue, since fighting games do that already. Like Street Fighter's been doing that for years, so it wouldn't be too crazy to ask for a Pokken complete version on the next Nintendo console. Heck, even giving us a sequel would be fine too. But when it gets right down to it, I feel like this game is reasonably accessible, but if you want the game at its fullest today, and the game with the most amount of stuff and content and characters, Pokken for the Nintendo Switch is the way to go. With that being said, let's go to the goods and the bads. Pokken does a really good job at being a fighting game in a non-traditional sense, because it works itself out very well. I feel like looking at it, it would definitely scare a lot of people, but once you get your hands on it and you understand, or the game or someone explains it to you, you'll be able to get it pretty quickly. I think another thing that's really great is that the super move, something I didn't talk about in gameplay, is really cool as well. It gives you a couple moments of more power behind your attack, and it also releases an amazing animation if you are able to hit your opponent. And I think that that's really good. I feel like the thing about Pokken is that it does a really good job being a non-traditional fighting game, and I think that if you haven't given it a chance and you looked at it and you think you want to give it a chance, I feel like this game definitely is worth that chance, especially if you've ever been out there looking for a Pokemon fighting game that has been officially released. I know that there's probably some out there that are fan-made, but I think that this is a really interesting way to go. I think the other thing I like about this is the concept of presentation that I've said before in the presentation segment, of where I like the way it was going. I would absolutely love to see a cleaned up version, which could possibly happen on the next Nintendo console. I would love to see this game get released one more time, or heck, even a sequel that would fix the visual issues. They're not that big of a deal, but they're ones that I think could easily be fixed and don't need to be fixed. I know that sounds like it's a bad, but it's not. And last but not least, I really like the Pokemon selection they had. I do wish that there was a little bit more variety within it, but once again, like I said before, this could have just been easily just fighting Pokemon only. So realistically, what we have is great, and I'd love to see more from it. And to be fair here, the reason why they probably chose the Pokemon they did is because they were just putting their foot in the water. It makes sense that the Pokemon that they chose here are not as diverse, but then again, when you're dealing with as many Pokemon as you're doing, heck, even back when Pokemon was new, there was way too many goddamn Pokemon. So no matter what, how I feel, somebody's going to be saying that this is a weird roster. Someone's going to have the same thing that I'm going to say, so no matter what, you can't win. I guess that's really, in truth, the blight of fighting games to a degree. That's what happened with Street Fighter 3, that's what happened with Garou Mark of the Wolves, that's what happens with games like Soul Calibur and other games where a character is missing or something is missing. There's always going to be that complaint of, I personally would like blank. So if it sounds like I'm complaining, no, because that's something that I feel like happens in fighting games in general. This one just, instead of it being a character that we've had in the past not showing up, it's more or less of, I would like to see more. So with all that being said, let's move on to the bads. The only thing that I really have to complain about is the fact that the way that the tournaments are set up feel very repetitive. I didn't talk about them in the gameplay section because I feel like I'm talking more about this game as a fighting game, and the way that the tournaments are set up are nothing special, but I feel like the story ones are very repetitive, kind of boring, and just, after you do one or two, you kind of get the point, and due to the fact that you can't switch your Pokemon on the spot, you have to go to Pokemon Home and then do a little song and dance to get your Pokemon out. Switching between Pokemon becomes a repetitive chore, so at the end of the day, realistically, the story itself is kind of the most repetitive thing, and it gets a little bit annoying, but it won't ruin your day, you know? You just have to buckle down, choose 3 Pokemon, and bada bing, bada boom, and even then, it's not bad, it's just frustrating, or that's even pushing it. So with that being said, let's move on to the final thoughts. So with all that being said, does Pokken hold up? Absolutely. I think that I would definitely recommend getting this game if you ever were interested in it. In truth, I would hope that they make a sequel at some point. I'd love to see more Pokemon, but where we are right now without there being one that was announced, and I have no clue if they're ever going to make another one, what we have is really good. And I think that if you ever wanted to try a Pokemon style fighting game, it feels at home. The gameplay and many other things about it just feels nice. So with that being said, what is your favorite Pokemon spinoff? Mine is right now Pokken or Mystery Dungeon, but if you have one, please leave it in the comment section below. And I'll see you guys here next time on Nostalgia Goggles. Bye!